Now we have as a discussant, Professor Stephen Holmes, that is teaching at New York University School of Law, where he is Walter E. Meyer Professor of Law and faculty co-director of the Center on Law and Security. Besides numerous articles on the history and of political thought, democratic and constitutional theory, state building in post-communist Russia, and the war on terror, his publications include Benjamin Constant and the Making of Modern Liberalism, Anatomy of Anti-Liberalism, Passions and Constraint, the Theory of Liberal Democracy, The Cost of Rise, co-author with Cass Sunstein, and the Matador Cape, America Reckless Response to Terror. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. So I'm not a historian certainly not of Italian 19th century history, and therefore to comment on Professor Davis's very learned, informative paper from which I learned a lot, I'm going to have to do it somewhat as an amateur, that is, as a political theorist, and to dig more deeply under the parallels and relations between American and Italian constitution making by posing the question in a way, what is a constitution and what does it do in these two cases? And I'm going to divide my remarks into three parts. One, a prehistory of Italian-American, earlier than the period discussed by Professor Davis. Second, about the 19th century, and I want to probe a little bit on relationships between the U.S. and Italy in the period where Professor Davis says they were attenuated. I think I can suggest that they weren't as attenuated as he says. And third, I'm going to say something about contemporary politics, because I was not a diplomat, and about the relation between the separation of powers and popular sovereignty or democracy. So obviously, the first big influence on the American founding, the first theoretical influence, the most important, was Machiavelli. And Machiavelli was important for Hamilton and for all the founders because he had a theory of the following sort. He said, Italy is divided into small republics. Because our republics are divided, we cannot defend ourselves against European monarchies. That is, France and Spain are having proxy wars on our soil, and they're using tactics of salami tactics to divide us against one another. And this, of course, appealed greatly to the American founders, who were faced with France and England, great European monarchies, who were fighting proxy wars on American soil and using salami tactics to divide them from each other. So the project of American constitution making was a Machiavellian project of union, that is, a republic of republics. Now, the American project succeeded, Machiavelli's project failed for many reasons, one of which is the Americans had the Atlantic moat to protect them from the European monarchies, which Italy didn't have because there was a land bridge by which the European monarchies could invade. But the point here is that union was the purpose. That is not, I think this is an important fact about constitution making, because we tend to think, partly in the post-totalitarian age, that the purpose of a constitution is to limit power. But in fact, in this period, America was very weak. Its purpose was to create power and create defensive power. And if you read the first third of the Federalist Papers, it's all about military power and the Constitution. And of course, this actually goes back to another Italian author, well, not Italian exactly, but another very important influence on the American founders was a writer who wrote not in Florence and long before Machiavelli, wrote in Rome, Polybius. And Polybius argued, and it's a text very well known by the American framers, that Rome, his question was, how did Rome, this little, you can see, think of this from the American framers' point of view. It's a little country. There's a very small population. In a period of 50 years, it takes over the entire Mediterranean. And what is the cause, says Polybius, asked Polybius, and his answer is the Constitution. Well, politea, but it's the Constitution. That is, it's how the city is organized. And above all, the most important point for the American framers of this was what you might call, or American constitutional lawyers would call, the equal footing doctrine. That is, Rome had the habit, erratic, not always true, but when it conquered a city, to give citizenship in various degrees to the conquered people, and that in that way it was swelled its army, increased its military power. The American expansion, because the Americans were competing against rival powers, that Spain was still there, they had something called the equal footing doctrine. They admitted new states on an equal footing. with the old states. They weren't subordinate. That's a very Roman idea. It's very clearly in Polybius. It's very clear in Roman constitutionalism. So the word constitution, if you read Diderot, the encyclopedia, what does it mean? It doesn't mean to limit. It means to set up. To constitute is to set up, to create, to make something, make it work. This positive idea, I think, is a very important element. It's setting up something in an unfriendly, difficult context, because there are other countries who are trying to interfere with you and mess around with you, and you're trying to prevent them from doing that. So it's not just about weakening power. It couldn't possibly mean that. And it's not an individualistic project either. I mean, there's another idea that constitutions are based on just individual rights. For the American settlers, individualism meant the right to be scalped on the frontier. They survived. The American settlers survived collectively. This was a collective effort, and deep in their psyche, that's why ancient constitutionalism appealed to them, why they respected founders, great founders or great legislators who made constitutions, weren't respected because they protected minority rights. They were respected because they increased the military power of the state. And young men had to train and discipline, which was the Constitution, because if they didn't, they would be enslaved. That is, they would lose their freedom. Unless they submitted to the discipline of the collectivity, they would be unfree because they would be conquered and enslaved. So the opposite of slavery was not do whatever you want individualism. It was coordinated, collective, cooperative action under a common framework. So the Constitution has that meaning. A second very important aspect of the early period was that for the Americans, the Constitution, there was a search to be recognized by the European powers. So we wanted recognition. This independence doesn't mean no interdependence. Independence is interdependence because it means being recognized by European powers as an independent country. So independence, this idea, it's not autarky. We're not talking about North Korea. This is a country that wants to join the family of nations. And the Constitution is something that is recognized. And the Europeans were very glad. They said, okay, now they're going to pay their debts. They're going to be coordinated. They're going to act in a way that's responsible. This is an early period. For the American founders, the law of nations was part of our Constitution. It was obvious we were, of course, weak then. This isn't the national security state created after World War II. But we believed in international law because it was the context in which we existed. And of course, with because of British background, this was also important. Now, one other aspect of this that has a Roman thing to it. Remember, the Romans, as they were conquering, they didn't have much trouble killing all the Aborigine peoples as they were civilizing the world. Well, and the Americans too. So international law, already in this period, distinguished between the civilized and barbaric. And civilized people killed only soldiers, combatants. They didn't kill women and children, civilians. The Indians we faced killed women and children. Therefore, they were uncivilized. Therefore, we had a right to exterminate them. So actually, the international law in this period was formed. It meant joining the civilized nations. Those who are outside the civilized nations can be treated like terrorists or barbarians or whatever they are. That was part of the understanding. And I think this is not to be, again, following up on Ambassador Gardner, to study American history doesn't mean to idealize it or to act as if it's some kind of all based on human rights and human dignity. It's also obviously based on genocide, and the United States was created by killing everyone who lived here. So that's part of the way the system worked. And I think it's impossible actually to understand the success of the American experiment of these 13 different colonies at the beginning who had very different interests. So what did they have in common? One thing was they were against the Europeans, but the other thing is they realized we cannot take over this huge landmass if we don't do it together. The states had conflicting claims over Western land. They said, we've got to stop that. We have to do this together. So it was the Union succeeded in the U.S., not in Italy, because we were protected by the Atlantic Moat. We had common interests against the European moat, but also because the takeover of this, European peoples had never had such a possibility to take over such fertile, incredibly fertile, promising land. And they said, we are going to be so rich, we are going to be the most powerful European nation if we do this together. Okay, so that's the first. 19th century. Now, Professor Davis has, I think he does, again, know everything about this. I know a little bit about Filangieri because, as you mentioned, I wrote a book on Benjamin Constant, who wrote a whole book commenting on Filangieri. But I think it also, the thesis of Professor Davis, if I've understood it, reminds me very much of a person everyone I think admires, Louis Hartz's analysis of the difference between the U.S. and Europe, and republicanism in the U.S. and Europe. And his claim, Louis Hartz in his famous book, Liberal Tradition in America, says, well, the European Republicans were fighting the king and the church, and therefore the republic, they had to sacralize it, and they gave it a kind of white heat, a powerful, almost sacred meaning, while the Americans, well, they didn't have the monarchy is far away, they didn't have an established church, so they were more lackadaisical about this and had a liberal consensus, which is why was never any fascism or communism in the U.S. Now, critics, of course, of Hartz have always said, what do you mean consensus? What about the Civil War? It's a little bit violent, and I think people talking about no violence in the United States in the 19th century should remember that. Okay, so this is where I'm getting off on get to Italy and the clue, Italy and the U.S. The clue is Lincoln's Cooper Union address, because you should look at it again. It has a wonderful passage. He's 1860. He is introducing himself to the Republican establishment. And in the speech he says, the philosophy of John Brown at Harper's Ferry is the same as the philosophy of Felice Orsini, who tried to kill Louis Napoleon. It's the same philosophy. So already there's a cult of assassination that he's aware of, which is very important given his own fate. And it's a cult of assassination which is transnational, it's violent, it has its political ends, it's about terrorism. Now, that to me is important because as mentioned, I also study Russia. And there's an unbelievably wonderful dinner party described in the memoirs of Alexander Herzen, which happens in 1853. And at this dinner party, there was Orsini, of course. It's a dinner party held in the office of the consul, George Saunders. Buchanan is ambassador sent by Pierce in 52, 53. And Pierce's ambassadorial appointments were all drawn from young America. At this dinner party was Mazzini, Garibaldi, Orsini, Kossuth, Ledru Rollin, famous for his subway stop now. And so there's a connection going on here, and I'll get what it is. So in the Democratic Review, and I think maybe I'll defer to you about this, but I believe, I'm vaguely remembering because I didn't have that much time to do research for this paper, but the Democratic Review did, which is in a way the original, the origin of opinion magazines in America, it did run articles by Mazzini. They were admiring Mazzini. And the editor of that journal was George Saunders or Sanders. And it was his house in which this dinner party happened in London in 1853. And Gerson, who's very funny, because Saunders is a Southerner, and of course, a slaveholder. And Gerson says he calls it the red dinner held by the black slave driver. So this was a connection. This is very anecdotal, so it's not historical like Professor Davis, but it's important because Mr. Saunders ended up being involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln. He knew John Wilkes Booth. He met John Wilkes Booth many times. So this Republican cult of assassination was in the air, and it was connecting the U.S. So, just in order to make, we don't want all Italian-American relations we want them to be complicated, right? We want them to be morally ambiguous. We don't want them just to be sunny and nice and we're all so kind to each other. There's also an international cult of assassination that's going on that was involved in the Civil War, and the Southerners, of course, there was an alienation because of slavery, but people like Orsini, he didn't like slavery either, but he liked assassination, as did George Saunders. Working in the American embassy is important. He was eventually thrown out because he was using the diplomatic pouch to bring in, guns or something. I think he was a gun runner. Okay, final. Separation of powers and popular sovereignty. It's an important topic because I know it's sometimes said by people that if you're elected by the public, then these being, let's say, investigated by magistrates is very undemocratic, to be contemporary. But so the question is what did the 18th century think about this, without getting into Italian politics, about which I don't actually know that much. But the historical point is the following, that in the 18th century, it was clear, people thought that how do citizens control politicians? They believed that periodic elections were not enough. And they were not enough for two reasons. One, as soon as someone is elected, he gets different interests than ordinary people. He's going to walk around, he never touches a doorknob. He becomes a different person. You're elected, you're in power. You become alienated from ordinary people. And second, asymmetry of information, because if you have power, you can prevent people from finding out what you do. Therefore, when they vote for you, they don't know what they're voting for. So that's a problem. And the reason you need auxiliary precautions, which are called constitutional, including plural sources of information, is so that the ability of those in power to control what information you have about their activity is broken down in some way, as well as having mutual, you can see this in a criminal trial. You wouldn't want a prosecutor on his own to decide if we're going to put someone to prison or to death. You want him to have to prove it in front of a tribunal that's independent of him, because you need the adversarial or process for correction. So this is based on this is in a way your question, what's the root of modern liberal constitutionalism? Modern liberal constitutionalism has three principles behind it, I would say. I'm coming to an end here pretty quickly. Okay, it goes like this. These are anthropological observations or descriptions. One, everyone makes mistakes, including powerful politicians. Two, everyone hates to admit their mistakes, especially powerful politicians. And three, everyone loves to expose the mistakes of their rivals. So a constitution, in a way, crystallizes these principles in its structure by having oversight, by having independent oversight, so that when people are making decisions, they are doing it knowing that someone is watching. And people do tend to behave better when they're watched than when they're not. Did you notice that? And maybe more the ability to align your interests with the system must align the interests of politicians with the public, and voting is just not enough to do that. It's also very important that politicians, when they're acting in secret and without anyone observing their behavior, are most vulnerable to disinformation. It's easiest to fool someone when no one is watching it, because you can play like Othello. This is a very good example for a constitution. So Othello has total executive discretion to decide what to do. So someone whispers in his ear, and he kills his wife, and then he says, whoops, that was bad information. So maybe before you make a decision, you should have someone check your information. And that's part of what constitutionalism is about. You don't go to war in Iraq, this is the American example, without actually discussing it with anyone who knows anything about it. Sounds like a bad idea. That principle of self-correction, which is, I think, a very deep constitutional rule. And the other purpose of a constitution, besides introducing mechanisms of self-correction, is to help avoid corruption, or the effect of money in politics, which you were talking about before, which is a scourge, of course. If you read the founding documents, American founders, you'll see that the separation of powers, which is called the essence of constitutionalism, isn't just about tyranny. It's a lot about foreign gold. They were worried that if you get the president the right not only to nominate an ambassador, but also to confirm the nomination, someone would buy it if just one person. So they wanted to avoid one-stop shopping for foreign corrupt actors. And so they would say, okay, president nominates, Senate has to confirm. Or in a treaty, you don't want foreigners to buy a treaty. So you have plural agencies or joint agency set up to avoid corrupt purchase of decisions in the interest of private wealth. So the problem of private wealth and capture of government by the rich, autocracy, was very much on their mind. And of course, the reason, again, why, and this is, I'm afraid I'm going to end not on an optimistic note, because we have so much money in politics now, it is almost impossible to imagine getting away from it. But the difference of accountability between a corrupt source of money for a politician and a voter is enormous. So if someone wants to pay a politician, let's say ExxonMobil or Merck or someone, if they want a piece of there's a payment for a service. It's very concrete. I pay you for this, you do that. You do this, you vote for it. The voters, they don't have that kind of reward system. Every few years, they are holding someone accountable for a whole series of actions which are diffuse over many years. And that form of accountability is just much weaker than paying someone. And of course, it even is weaker since in order to be elected, you need money. Which is why, unfortunately, I think the early ideals about democratic, accountable government where citizens control politicians may be not have a bright future.
Thank you very much.